Welcome to Storyverse, where stories speak and you learn English naturally. Chapter 1. The Red-Haired Visitor. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I, Dr. Watson, decided to pay a visit to my old friend Sherlock Holmes. His rooms at Baker Street always had the scent of tobacco, old books, and something indefinably brilliant in the air. But this morning, something was different. As I stepped inside, I noticed Holmes was not alone. Seated opposite him was a rather large man with a flushed red face, narrow eyes, and an extraordinary head of flaming red hair. He clutched a crumpled newspaper in one hand, and his heavy coat looked worn from years of use. "I see you're busy, Holmes," I said, stepping back. "I'll come another time." But Holmes smiled warmly. "Nonsense, Watson. You came at the perfect moment." I was puzzled. "But you said you're very busy." "I am," he replied with a glint in his eye. "Very busy, which is why I need you to stay. Dr. Watson has helped me in many of my most successful cases," he added, turning to the red-haired man. "I'm sure he can help with yours, too, Mr. Wilson." The man stood and offered a meaty hand. "Very pleased to meet you, Doctor. Watson, name's Jabez Wilson." We all sat down. Holmes's tone turned thoughtful. "This case, Watson, is quite unusual. Just your kind of puzzle." Mr. Wilson, still holding the newspaper, began flipping through its pages with thick fingers stained slightly with ink and age. From his coat, his hands, and even the way he sat, I could tell he was a common British tradesman, an ordinary man not used to high drama or detectives. Holmes noticed me watching and grinned. "Trying to deduce, Watson?" he teased. "Well, here's what I see. Mr. Wilson was once a workman, he spent time in China, and recently he's been doing a lot of writing." Wilson's jaw dropped. "You're right. But how did you know all that?" Holmes leaned forward. "Your right hand is larger than your left. That tells me that you worked hard with your hands once upon a time. The sleeve on that same arm is more worn, suggesting hours spent writing at a desk recently. As for China, you've got a pink fish tattooed on your right hand, a style done only there. And look, your watch chain holds a Chinese coin." Wilson blinked in amazement, then laughed. "Well, at first I thought you were a magician. But now I see. Maybe it wasn't all so difficult." Holmes turned to me and chuckled. "And that, Watson, is why I sometimes avoid explaining my methods. It takes away the magic." Then to Mr. Wilson he said, "Now, did you find the advertisement?" "Yes," Mr. Wilson replied, tapping the newspaper. "Here it is." He pointed to a peculiar ad that ran in the Morning Chronicle 2 months ago. I leaned forward to read. "The Red-Headed League. Man needed for new job at the League. Pay £4 a week. Office-based work. Only for men with red hair. Apply at 7 Pope's Court, Fleet Street, London, 11 o'clock Monday morning. Duncan Ross." I blinked. "What does that even mean?" Holmes leaned back, amused. "Strange, isn't it, Watson? And now, Mr. Wilson, please, tell us your story, all of it, from your home to your work, and exactly how you became involved with this Red-Headed League." And so the curious tale began. A tale that, though it started with something as harmless as red hair, would soon reveal a much darker plan hidden beneath the surface. Chapter 2. The Red-Headed League. Mr. Wilson settled into his chair, the newspaper still trembling slightly in his hands as he began. "I run a small shop on Saxe-Coburg Square," he said, "just beneath my home. It's not much, but it pays the bills. My only assistant is a man named Vincent Spaulding. A clever fellow, really. He helps out for half the usual wage because he wants to learn the trade." Holmes leaned in. "That's quite unusual, a hard-working man who settles for less pay. Tell me more about him." "Well," Wilson continued, "Spaulding's not exactly young, but he moves quickly, loves photography, spends hours in the cellar developing pictures. Sometimes he's down there for half the day." "And besides him," Holmes asked, "there's just a young girl who cooks and cleans. Spaulding, the girl, and myself, we're the only ones in the house. My wife passed away, and I never had children." Holmes gave a small nod, encouraging him to go on. "One day, about 2 months ago," Wilson said, "Spaulding came into the shop holding this newspaper and said, 'What a shame my hair isn't red.' I asked him what on earth he meant. With a smile, Mr. Wilson mimicked Spaulding's voice. 'There's an easy job going, sir, but it's only for men with bright red hair. And yours is perfect. You should apply.'" Curiosity sparked in his eyes, even as he told the tale. He pointed out the ad. Said it was placed by something called the Red-Headed League. They were offering £4 a week just to sit in an office and do light work. £4 a week? I repeated. That was a decent sum, especially for doing practically nothing. "Exactly," said Wilson. "Spaulding told me the league was started by a rich American named Ezekiah Hopkins. He was red-headed too, and apparently left all his money to fund jobs for other red-haired men, but only in London, and only men with very bright red hair." Holmes chuckled. "That explains the ad. What did you do?" "I agreed to go," Wilson said. "Spaulding insisted on coming with me, so I closed the shop for the day, and off we went to Fleet Street." He paused, shaking his head with a grin. "I've never seen so many red-haired men in one place. Pope's Court looked like a sea of orange flames, but mine was the brightest. Spaulding pushed through the crowd, and we reached a tiny office, just 2 chairs, a table, and some bookshelves. Inside was a small man with hair even redder than mine. He was interviewing applicants one by one and turning them all away. Then it was my turn." Mr. Wilson's voice softened, amused by the memory. He stood up, came right over to me, and tugged my hair so hard I yelled. He said, "It's real. You're hired." Holmes smiled. "Duncan Ross?" "Yes, that was his name. Said he was the league secretary, shook my hand, called me lucky, and asked when I could start." "And did Spaulding agree to manage the shop?" Holmes asked. "He did. Said he'd take care of everything in my absence. I only had to work from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., Monday through Saturday. 4 hours a day, that was it." I looked at Holmes. "And the work?" Wilson gave a sheepish grin. "They told me to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica, starting with the letter A. I had to bring my own pen, ink, and paper. I wasn't allowed to leave the office before 2 p.m., not even for a moment." "For how long did this go on?" I asked. 8 weeks, Wilson replied. "Every day I sat there copying articles about aardvarks, algebra, and Arctic birds. Every Saturday Mr. Ross would give me 4 gold coins. I nearly finished the entire letter A." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And then?" Wilson's cheerful expression darkened. "Then it ended." He paused. "This morning I arrived at 10 sharp, like always, but the door was locked. A sign was pinned to it. It read, 'The Red-Headed League is dissolved. October 9th, 1890. His voice trembled slightly. "No explanation, no notice, just gone." Holmes and I exchanged glances. Mr. Wilson leaned forward. "I asked everyone in the building. No one had heard of Duncan Ross. No one had even seen him leave. I was stunned, angry, so I went home and told Spaulding." "And what did he say?" Holmes asked softly. "He looked surprised. Said it was strange, but didn't know anything more." Wilson sighed. "I didn't know what else to do. That's when I came to you, Mr. Holmes. I can't afford to lose 4 pounds a week. Not after all that work." Holmes folded his hands and leaned back. "Oh, Mr. Wilson, you may have lost a job, yes, but you've brought us something far more valuable." I leaned closer. "What do you mean?" Holmes's eyes lit up. "This, Watson," he said, "is not just an odd advertisement. It's a clue." And with that, the mystery deepened. Chapter 3. Something Below the Surface. The morning after Mr. Wilson's strange story, the fog had hardly lifted from Baker Street when Holmes emerged, hat tilted, eyes sharp. I followed him into the cold London air, notebook in hand, uncertain of what he was truly thinking. But one thing was clear. His mind was turning rapidly beneath that quiet gaze. "We must visit Saxe-Coburg Square," he said as we walked. "There's more to this assistant of Wilson's than a fondness for red ink and photographs." The square greeted us with tired buildings and narrow doors. Grass struggled to grow in the middle, surrounded by houses pressed shoulder to shoulder, like silent witnesses. "There it is," Holmes said, pointing to a modest shop. The faded sign above the door read, "Jabez Wilson, pawnbroker." He slowed down in front of the building and took his cane from his side. Without a word, he tapped it firmly against the pavement once, twice, 3 times, listening carefully to the echo that answered. "Stone," he muttered, "but hollow beneath." I blinked. "You're testing the ground." Holmes nodded. "Every building has secrets, Watson. You just have to knock hard enough to hear them." Moments later, the shop door opened. A young man stepped out, wiping his hands on his apron. He looked to be in his 30s, with quick eyes and a faint white scar above one eyebrow. There was a certain smoothness to him, as if every move he made had already been planned. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked politely. Holmes smiled. "Yes, my good fellow. Can you direct us to the Strand?" "Third right, fourth left," the man replied without hesitation. "Thank you," Holmes said with a bow. As we walked away, I whispered, "You didn't really need directions?" "No," Holmes replied softly, "but I needed to see him. And more importantly, his knees." I frowned. "His knees?" "They're covered in dust, Watson, red clay specifically, the kind you find only when you've been digging underground for hours." I paused. "You think he's tunneling?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "We shall see. But let's not stop there." He led me through a winding path until we stood behind the square. It was a livelier street, with shops buzzing, bakeries, a tobacconist, a newspaper vendor, and tucked quietly among them, the City and Suburban Bank. Holmes pointed with his cane. "Right there, that's where the tunnel ends, if I'm not mistaken." I stared in disbelief. "You're saying this whole red-headed league was a trick to get Wilson out of the shop while they dug a tunnel to rob the bank?" "Exactly," Holmes said. "An elaborate distraction. They needed time, silence, and daily access to the cellar. Mr. Wilson's encyclopedia project gave them all three." "And the man we met at the shop isn't Vincent Spaulding at all," Holmes replied. "His real name is John Clay, one of the most dangerous criminals in London, brilliant, ruthless, and now very close to his prize." I felt a shiver. What now? Holmes checked his watch. Now we wait. But tonight, Watson, bring your revolver. Chapter 4. A Strange Stakeout. The night was thick with silence when I arrived at Baker Street. The hour was 10. London's usual noise had begun to fade into shadows, and yet something in the air felt sharper than usual, like the city itself was holding its breath. 2 carriages stood waiting outside 221B. Inside, Holmes was already in motion, his long coat buttoned tight, a glint in his eye that I'd come to know well, the glint of a man who was moments away from springing a trap. "Watson," he said briskly, "tonight may bring danger. I trust you brought your revolver." I nodded, loaded and ready. In the parlor stood 2 men, one tall and solemn, wearing dark clothes and a face made for frowns. The other, broad-shouldered with a constable's stance and an ever-alert gaze, was Inspector Peter Jones of Scotland Yard. "Meet Mr. Merriweather," Holmes said, gesturing to the tall man, "director of the City and Suburban Bank, and tonight part of our little midnight adventure." Mr. Merriweather looked mildly annoyed. "I missed my weekly card game for this, Mr. Holmes. That's 37 years of perfect attendance broken." Holmes grinned. "It's a small price to pay for saving £30,000 in gold." That silenced the room. Soon we were aboard the carriages, rattling through the sleeping streets. No one spoke much, except Holmes, who softly hummed fragments from the concert we'd attended earlier. The contrast between his calm and the gravity of our mission was unsettling. The carriages stopped behind the bank on a quiet back street. Mr. Merriweather used a set of old keys to let us into a side door. We passed through a labyrinth of corridors, stone and shadow, door after door, until we reached a heavy wooden entrance at the end. With effort, it creaked open to reveal the bank's cellar. It was a large underground room, damp and echoing, filled with wooden crates and the scent of old earth. In the far corners, the dim glow of our lamps barely reached. Mr. Merriweather walked toward the nearest box and tapped it. "French gold," he said quietly. £30,000 in coins, a fortune in a basement." Holmes raised a hand. "Speak softly. The floor may have ears." He crouched low and used a magnifying glass to examine the cracks between the cellar stones. "We don't have long," he murmured. "They'll act once Mr. Wilson is in bed, likely within the hour." Then he turned down the lamp, plunging us into darkness. We crouched in silence, motionless behind the crates. The only sounds were our breath and the distant ticking of Mr. Merriweather's pocket watch. Every creak of wood, every rustle of cloth, seemed louder in the dark. Minutes passed, then more. The weight became a weight on our backs, heavier with every second. Suddenly, Holmes tensed. A sliver of light appeared between 2 stones in the floor, then a scraping noise, a faint metallic sound. We held our breath. A large stone shifted. Up came a white hand, followed by the glint of a lantern's flame. Slowly, a figure emerged from the tunnel. Vincent Spaulding, or rather, John Clay. Behind him came another man, smaller, with a mop of vivid red hair. Holmes rose without a word and surged forward like a striking hawk. Clay turned, saw him, and shouted, "Archie, run!" But it was too late. The second man dove back into the tunnel, but Holmes knocked the gun from Clay's hand with his cane. Jones rushed in, iron cuffs ready. "You don't have a chance, John Clay," Holmes said calmly. Clay smirked, catching his breath. I suppose not. But I do admire your work, Mr. Holmes. Quite well done. You too, Holmes replied. Your red-headed league was a clever disguise. Jones pulled Clay to his feet. Let's go, Your Highness, he mocked. Time to meet the magistrate. Do be gentle, Clay replied with mock dignity. I am the grandson of a royal duke, after all. The moment was surreal. Two criminals cornered in a bank's basement, one still trying to maintain airs of nobility. But Holmes didn't smile. Outside, other officers had already captured the second man. The tunnel was secured. The crime had been stopped just minutes before it could change lives forever. As we walked out into the chilled night air, Holmes simply said, No shots fired. That's what I call a successful evening. Chapter 5. The Face Behind the Mask. The early morning hours found us back at Baker Street, the fire barely lit, the city still wrapped in sleep. Holmes sat quietly in his armchair, a teacup steaming in one hand, his violin resting beside him. The night had passed in chaos and silence, in whispers and footsteps. But now it was time for answers. You see, Watson, he said with a weary smile, some mysteries are solved not by brilliance, but by dirt on a man's trousers. I leaned forward. You knew about the tunnel? Not at first, Holmes replied. But something never felt right about Mr. Wilson's story. A red-headed league paying £4 a week just for copying an encyclopedia. It was too elaborate, too generous, and far too convenient. He took a sip of tea, then continued, So I began to ask myself, why would anyone want to keep a harmless old pawnbroker busy for 4 hours a day? The answer, he said, came the moment he saw the assistant. That calm, confident man with a faint scar above his brow and worn knees on his trousers. That wasn't Vincent Spaulding, Holmes said. That was John Clay, one of the most dangerous and intelligent criminals in England, a man with royal blood and a criminal's heart. John Clay had created the Red-Headed League as a distraction. It was never real, just a clever mirage designed to give him uninterrupted time beneath the shop, while Mr. Wilson sat upstairs copying the letter A. Clay was digging a tunnel through to the bank's gold cellar. And the timing? I asked. Simple, Holmes said. The League disbanded suddenly. That told me the tunnel was finished. They were ready, and Saturday night was perfect. Quiet streets, no bank staff until Monday. I stared into the fire. They almost pulled it off. Holmes nodded. Yes, Watson, they were hours from making history, a silent robbery, a fortune in gold, and no witnesses. But your plan, I said, it worked. It worked, Holmes agreed, though his tone was thoughtful. We waited, we watched, and we struck just in time. One man fled into the tunnel, but he was caught at the other end by officers waiting outside Wilson's home. And Clay? Taken without a fight, Holmes said. Cunning men recognize when the game is over. There was a long silence then, the kind that lingers after a storm. I looked at Holmes, the way he stared into the distance, thoughtful, unreadable. You enjoyed this case, I said quietly. Yes, he admitted, but not for the reasons you think. Not because of the chase or the crime, but because in the end it was about observation. Small details, a speck of dust, a wrinkle in fabric, a job offer too good to be true. He rose slowly and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the faint blue glow of dawn creeping over the rooftops. London sleeps, he murmured, but somewhere another plan is already being made, another mystery begins. I followed his gaze into the morning. The city was quiet, for now. Chapter 6. Holmes explains it all. The lamps of Baker Street burned low as morning light gently filtered through the curtains. The silence inside the flat was broken only by the gentle clink of porcelain, as Holmes set down his teacup and leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. I sat across from him, still trying to piece it all together. "How on earth," I said at last, "did you figure it all out?" Holmes smiled faintly, as though he'd been waiting for that very question. "Watson," he began, "this case was never about what was obvious. It was about what was unlikely." He rose and began to pace, the tails of his dressing gown trailing behind him like the cloak of a man unraveling the fabric of a perfect illusion. "An advertisement for a job that pays £4 a week, for copying an encyclopedia, offered only to men with bright red hair," he repeated slowly. "A man like Jabez Wilson, harmless and trusting, was the perfect bait. But the job itself? Nonsense." He paused and looked at me. "It was a trap, but not for Wilson. It was by Clay." I frowned. "To keep him away from the shop?" "Exactly," Holmes said. "The moment Wilson told me about his assistant, Spaulding, who vanished into the cellar for hours under the guise of photography, I knew something was buried beneath the floorboards. Literally." He walked over to the mantel and tapped his pipe thoughtfully. "And when I visited the shop, it confirmed everything. The knees of Spaulding's trousers were worn and covered with reddish-brown dust, the kind found in old London cellars. He'd been digging." I recalled the moment clearly, Holmes rapping his cane on the pavement outside the shop. "I was testing the ground," he said, reading my thoughts, "trying to locate the tunnel's path. When I found that the City and Suburban Bank sat just behind Mr. Wilson's shop, it all fell into place." "But the timing?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "Once Clay closed the Red-Headed League, I knew the tunnel was ready. Saturday night was ideal. Quiet streets and no bank staff until Monday. I gathered the right men and we waited in the cellar." He paused, then added, "They almost pulled it off, Watson." "It was brilliant. I dare say I respect the method, if not the motive." "And John Clay?" I asked. Holmes' eyes darkened a little. "A dangerous mind. Ruthless, but arrogant. He underestimated how far a man will go to uncover the truth." We sat in silence for a while. Then Holmes turned to me, his tone softer. "You see, Watson, the world is full of clues. They whisper in the cracks of the pavement, in the stains on a sleeve, in the color of earth on a man's knees. All you have to do is listen." I smiled. "And fortunately, London has you to listen for us." He chuckled and poured another cup of tea. "Another case closed," he said quietly. Outside, the streets of London were waking up. Footsteps echoed on cobblestones, market carts creaked into motion, and somewhere in the unseen folds of the city, another mystery waited to be found. But for now, the great detective rested.